At Andover Newton as the Director of Community Life and Spiritual Formation. And on behalf of Andover Newton, we are so glad that you are here. I offer the warmest of welcomes to you as we gather together for our 2023 Simpson-Hewett Lecture. Yes. And so to get us started, I invite you into a posture of prayer. Gracious God, we meet you first and foremost with our breath. Spirit of living God, fall fresh upon us. Connect us in mind, in body, and in spirit. Holy One, we uplift our special guest, Right Mother, Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk. May you open our ears to hear what you have placed on her heart to speak today. May we be able to receive this prophetic gift from a legacy that is in our midst. We offer thanks as well for our school, Andover Newton, a school that resides at the intersections, God. God of community, we uplift gratitude for Glen Church, our hosts this afternoon, and for the alignments of mission that have brought us together. God of justice, we acknowledge you as we seek to do the work that you have called us to here and now. Equip us to move with discernment as we see what part we might play, as we ask for grace as we move forward together in unity. God of compassion, may each of our streams collide in your lake of love as we continue to fight for equity, inclusion, and liberation, God. And may freedom ring in all of this, because God, there is work for us to do. May justice roll down like water, as Amos said. And may these waters wash over us here in the West, as well as outpour on our siblings in the East and everywhere in between. May this water nourish us as we orient ourselves towards accountability and reconciliation, God, in the reckoning. May this water nurture us too as we strive to pass down futures of flourishing. May we navigate these waters with you, Divine One, for you, God, have work for us to do. God has work for us to do. God has work for us to do, till God's will is done and all things are made new. God has work for us to do. May we do it with you, Divine One. Amen, and may it be so.
Let us build a house where love can dwell and all can safely live, a place where saints and children tell how hearts learn to forgive, built on hopes and dreams and visions, rock of faith and vault of grace. Here the love of Christ shall end divisions. All are welcome, all are welcome, all are welcome in this place. Let us build a house where prophets speak and words are strong and true, where all God's children dare to seek, to dream of God's reign anew. Here the cross shall stand as witness and as symbols of God's grace. Here as one we claim the faith of Jesus. All are welcome, all are welcome, all are welcome in this I am Marilyn Kendricks, a member here, and so on behalf of the entire community of Spring Glen Church, I want to extend a radically extravagant welcome to each and every one of you. Spring Glen Church is a church founded in 1929 in the congregational tradition, and it was in that stream that this church immediately joined the newly formed United Church of Christ in 1957. Our mission statement says, "We are a congregation firmly committed to the gospel of Jesus Christ. But instead of insisting on any single interpretation, we invite each other to share his or her or their own faith and spirituality so that the whole body may be nurtured mutually." And so, in partnership with Andover Newton Theological School at Yale Divinity School, we are honored to host this lecture where I know beyond any doubt we will be nurtured. As an African American woman ordained in the United Church of Christ, I am doubly honored to welcome my sister, the Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk, who was the first African American woman ordained in this denomination. I stand in the long line of Black women of the cloth who followed in Dr. Delk's footsteps. As a church claiming Christian kinship with other UCC churches of the congregational stream of the United Church of Christ, it is right and fitting that this lecture by Dr. Delk should be held here, where she will reveal to us the fifth strain of denominational tradition, and we are honored to serve as your hosts.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Birmingham Drummond, and I bring you greetings from Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School, the school that I serve as founding dean. It is amazing to look out at this congregation of people gathered, to see so many who have connected with Andover Newton and with Spring Glen Church in so many different ways and during so many different chapters of the life of our respective communities. So I have the best seat in the house right now, and I just want you to know you're very, very beautiful. My role in preparing us for our Simpson-Hewett lecture is to contextualize what this lecture is and why it's important. The Simpson-Hewett lecture on congregational history has been part of the life of Andover Newton for decades, but it lay fallow in our Newton, Massachusetts campus for about 10 years for us to revitalize it here in New Haven upon our relocation and affiliation. Recent past lecturers include Professor Tisa Wenger, who offered a lecture on the ethics of commemorating the bicentennial of Yale and Andover's missions in Hawaii. Another was author Marilyn Robinson, who reflected on the mixed legacy of New England congregationalism and how it's reflected in literature. Last year, our lecturer was attorney and Native American environmental rights advocate Patrick Gonzalez Rogers, who spoke with us on best practices for congregational land acknowledgements. Today, we'll hear a lecture, as Reverend Kendricks has shared, on the innovation of thinking about the United Church of Christ's fifth stream. This book is beautiful. This book is meaningful. I would say especially I love the chapters by Dr. Delk herself because I can hear your voice as I read them. And in terms of the history of history, it's really a very important book for our denomination, the United Church of Christ, because it causes us to rethink the way we tell our story. Up until not 5 years ago, we told our story in terms of 4 streams and then this agglomeration of hidden histories that were edited into 2 volumes by Barbara Brown Zickman in ways that were incredibly meaningful at the time and really leading edge at the time, but not maybe for such a time as this, where what these days call for is a penitent reconsideration of defining a denomination in terms of mainstream and hidden. You've raised a question for us, Dr. Delk, and it's a question that I suspect that our students and graduates will be grappling with far after we're all out of the picture. So I thank you for this important work that's setting polity teachers like me on new trajectories and really challenging the status quo. You've come, many have come here today to talk about history. And I am deeply touched that a lecture on history would draw together so many in so many different settings and contexts. History is rich, and the study of it is venerable. We all want to be part of something transcendent. We all want to be part of a story that is bigger than our own. Our history is important because it helps us to feel like we are part of a grand narrative. It also helps us to understand the trajectories on which our ancestors set us, so we can decide if we require a course correction or if we want to allow our ancestors to be the wind beneath our wings. We have free will in the midst of history. Most importantly, for a day such as today, we refer to all that we've learned about history and how it teaches us that there is no such thing as a historical systemic transformation. Systemic transformation requires deep appreciation for and respect for our history, respect for the ways in which it set patterns that don't just unpattern themselves. There is no such thing as a historical systemic transformation, and we're living in a time where God is calling out to us to lead systemic transformation. Thank you for being part of this historic moment for Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School, for Spring Glen United Church of Christ, and for the United Church of Christ. Thank you.
May the peace of Christ be with you.
And also with you.
May the love of Christ be with you.
And also with you.
And may the justice of Christ be with you.
And also with you.
My name is Ned Allen Parker. I'm Associate Dean at Andover Newton Seminary at Yale Divinity School, and it is my great honor to introduce our speaker for the day. I also want to thank Spring Glen Church for hosting, and a special thanks to Oliver Mesmer, who is our Hancock Postgraduate Fellow, who many of you received personal invitations from. So thank you, Oliver, for doing that behind-the-scenes work. A graduate of Andover Newton Theological School, for over 60 years, the Reverend Dr. Yvonne Delk has been a strong ally in the fight for human and civil rights for people of color, children, and the poor. Today, she remains a clear and prolific and moral voice in search of justice and equality for the oppressed within the U.S. interfaith community. In 1974, Dr. Delk became the first African-American woman to be ordained as clergy in the United Church of Christ. From 1981 to 1990, she served as executive director of the UCC's Office of Church and Society, an organization that seeks to relate biblical teachings to current social issues. My. In 1990, Reverend Delk became the first woman and African-American executive director of the Community Renewal Society, a faith-based Chicago metropolitan area mission agency related to the United Church of Christ that works to empower people to dismantle racism and poverty in order to build just communities. And from 1984 to 1997, she served as representative of the United Church of Christ to the World Council of Churches in Geneva, Switzerland. In this capacity, she served as the chair of the WCC's program to combat racism, worked with a committee of 25 persons from all regions of the globe, visited 5 continents to build alliances between movement groups and churches on issues of racial justice and ending the apartheid in South Africa. She is the founding director of the Center for African American Theological Studies located in Chicago, and she's the editor of the book we will hear more on shortly. This is the story of faith, survival, empowerment in the hostile environment of racism. This holy stream of African spirituality that flowed across the Atlantic Ocean up to the tidewaters of Virginia in 1619, the same stream that overflowed in 1957 into the worship and work of the United Church of Christ, is given its long overdue place in the canon of the UCC. I personally am excited to share that tomorrow, the Reverend Dr. Delk will receive Andover Newton's Spirit of the Hill Award, an award conferred once a year to an alum who is making the world a better, more just place for human flourishing. So, an early congratulations to you. Reverend Delk was featured in an article and the cover of Sojourner's May-June 1999 issue as one who is anointed by history and by the Spirit, and as one who has kept her eyes on the world as God intends. In that article, it is written, to sit in the presence of Yvonne Delk is to sit with living history. Not just her life, but the lives of her ancestors. She is regal, a spiritual phenomenon, and a mighty wind. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
I don't know if it's double duty since I'm mic'd here and this is here. So does it matter? Okay. I am honored to be here. I greet you in the name of God, a God of love, a God of justice and freedom, a God of hope and liberation. I greet you in the name of the mothers and fathers who did not live to see this day, but whose faith allowed me to be present for this day. I greet you in the name of family and faith and freedom. And I greet you looking out over this audience, seeing so many of you who mean so much to me. I have been on this journey for a long time. And when I look out and see my son there, not by birth, but by spirit, when I look out and see those of you that I have walked with in the United Church of Christ, and we've been family walking this road together for such a long time, I'm honored. When I see my friend Deborah, we connected with the World Council of Churches, and as we stood there against apartheid as well as against racism in the United States, I know that who we are, in part, is by the choices that we make and the people that we choose to walk with. But most of all, I stand here with my parents, Marcus and Cora Delk, who believed that there was something in me that was meant to be a word that would live long after they had passed. They instilled into me a love of God, a love of faith, and a love of freedom. So this is going to be an interesting lecture because I don't feel it as a lecture. I feel it as if I'm sharing with all of you who have gathered here a part of me and the journey that I've been on. The story in the book, The Afro-Christian Convention, is the story of the convention that my church, Macedonia Afro-Christian United Church of Christ, was a part of. It was the church that my mother joined when she was pregnant with me, thinking she would only be there as a watch care member, but ending up being there for our entire life. It was so odd that a church she joined in order to protect the baby that she was carrying in her would be the Afro-Christian connection that would lead me to the United Church of Christ. My father at the time was with the First United Holiness Church of America because his mama and his daddy were holiness. My mama was Baptist, and all of her mama and daddy were Baptist, and all of them were Baptists. The only connection we had to this United Church of Christ journey that I'm a part of now was that my mother had lost a child before me and was very much concerned. That baby only lived for about 6 months, and my mother was very concerned that this baby that she was now pregnant with would live. And there was this little church in the community across the way. And so she walked over there to join it only as a watch care member. She was going back to her Baptist church after I was born. However, it ended up with a different narrative, and I'm so grateful. As I stand here, it doesn't seem possible to me that 60 years have passed since I received the Master of Religious Education degree from Andover, Newton. And as I stand here reflecting on how much has changed, 60 years ago, I entered as a student preparing for my calling. And now 60 years later, I'm an elder with a word about your calling. 60 years ago, I was the only African-American female in the class of 1961. And today, the statistics have changed so dramatically. 60 years ago, along with every other female in that class, I was housed at the bottom of the hill, while everything that related to the identity of the hill was at the top. The men's dormitory, the classrooms, the dining hall, the president's home, the chapel, and of course, with the exception of Henry Brooks, the faculty was white and male. What a difference in the faculty of today. 60 years ago, your location was on a hill, high and lifted up above the noise of the city. And today, you're located in the heart of the city. And you've moved from an independent living space to an interdependent living space with Yale Divinity. The president of Andover, Newton in 1961 was Herbert Gesorg, who was born in Instenburg, Germany. Herbert Gesorg, who said no to a narrative of Nazism and fascism and said yes to a narrative of faith, hope, and love. In 2023, the founding dean of Andover Newton is Sarah B. Drummond, born in the United States of America, first female to lead Andover Newton. Sarah B. Drummond, pastor, teacher, ethicist, who has made a decision to dig deep and bloom for life and hope and community in a nation deeply divided by hate and power and privilege. And here I am, 84, elder. There's an African proverb that says, it does not matter what they call you, it's what you answer to that really matters. And these days, I am very pleased to answer to elder, and most call me Mother Yvonne. And all of us who've gathered for this lecture to be in this church at this time in the context of a nation that continues to be deeply embedded and entrenched in racism with its lingering effects, have made a decision about who you are. And as I stand here speaking about oppression and another narrative in the United States, I'm also painfully aware of what is happening in Ukraine and in Israel and the Gaza Strip. What those of us who know what it means to live under oppression is that the fruit of injustice is a vicious cycle of hate and violence. And what we also know is that where there is no justice, there will be no peace. And I can hear Dr. Martin Luther King's words as he stood in the pulpit of Riverside Church in 1967, saying to us, we can no longer afford to worship the God of hate or bow before the altar of retaliation. The oceans of history are cluttered with so much that in fact leads us to the wreckage of hate, of self-defeating denial of what it could be or meaning for us to be community. And so the question that I bring in this moment with you is who or what really defines who we are and ways that we are not free to walk away from. It's a question about which narratives we choose to live by. It's a question about what is foundational to our reason for being. It's about that which informs the choices that we make, that shapes our belief, that influences what we see. It is that which impacts what we do, our call, our purpose. Howard Thurman speaks of the need for something that will not give. He says it's a strange freedom to be adrift in the world without a sense of anchor anywhere. Always there is a need of mooring, the need for that firm grip on something that is rooted and will not give. For me, my narrative and the choices I have made have been grounded and rooted in faith and family and freedom. I was born in 1939 in Norfolk, Virginia, under the law of the land that separated the races. Growing up black in America resulted in my facing a wall of hostility, prejudice, second-class citizenship, hatred, discrimination based on my race, my culture, and my place of origin, Africa. I call this Afrophobia. In Norfolk, I experienced the white-only signs, Afrophobia, separate drinking, fines, separate classrooms, Afrophobia. I remember going down to Woolworth's lunch counter or Grant's department store before I sat in there. But just being there in that place and waiting for someone to see me, recognize me. I was very clear that when seen through the eyes of not all, but most whites in Norfolk, Virginia, I was seen as being genetically inferior, a second-class citizen who had no rights that they were bound to respect, Afrophobia. As I have framed this reflection in the context of truth-telling and truth-facing, let me confess first that the decision, Sarah, to enroll at Andover Newton Theological Seminary in 1961 was not an easy decision. I knew that I would be leaving my home base of all that had loved me and nurtured me, breathed life into me, that I would be leaving home, the Afro-Christian Convention, all those mamas and daddies who prayed over me, inspired me, loved me. I knew that I would be entering another world where they did not know me, my name, my parents, the Afro-Christian tradition, my history or culture. I actually cried all the way as I traveled on a Greyhound bus from Norfolk, Virginia to Boston, Massachusetts. And the taxi that drove me from the Greyhound bus station in Boston to Newton Center put me and all my belongings out at the bottom of the hill. I envisioned that at the top of that hill that I was going to have to climb was another wall of attitudes and prejudices and beliefs that embody Afrophobia. I could feel myself becoming fearful and anxious and very much alone when someday somebody joined me, took my belongings, my suitcase, and I think I must have had 2 at the time with me, and began the journey with me up the hill. I didn't ask for their name, and I don't think they asked for mine. I was just grateful that I didn't have to climb that hill alone. It was much later that I realized it was Herbert Gazak, the stranger who walked me up the hill, was actually the president of the hill. Who or what defines who we are and ways that we are not free to walk away from? How odd that a German pastor and teacher and an African-American female, each with deep roots in an oppressive narrative, would meet on a hill with a commitment to live out a different narrative. Amanda Gorman, in the spoken word poem delivered at President Biden's inauguration, entitled "The Hill We Climb," says we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, and that climbing that hill in America is more than pride that we inherit. It is the past that we step into in order to figure out how to repair it. Amanda's words. We're living in what Dr. King would call the fierce urgency of now. We're still a broken and deeply divided nation. There's a loss of vital connection to the sources of meaning, purposes, values, shared responsibility. And this is a time for truth and truth-telling. Truth is something active. It does something. In fact, it does something to us. It liberates us. The Gospel of John 8:32 reminds us that when you know that truth, the truth can set you free. Bishop Desmond Tutu understood that the reconciliation of white South Africans with black South Africans depended on telling the truth about the sin of apartheid, the oppression, and the consequences of living in apartheid. Truth-facing calls for an honest and accurate appraisal of our social, historical, political situation. And if the diagnosis is not deep enough, is not full enough, we will heal the wound lightly. We will cry peace and peace when there is no peace. So it's important that we harbor no illusions about our predicament or about who we are. My friend, Dr. Deborah Robinson, who is here, reminded me that on July the 4th, 2026, we will be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the United States independence. A time of lifting up core values, celebrating America the beautiful, the land of the free and the brave. We'll salute our flag, pay homage to the Statue of the Liberty. However, because we have refused to learn from our past, we will engage in an attitude of realistic dancing and denial. We will have bigger and bigger parades, believing if we cheer loud enough, we'll drown out the pain and the cost of empty victories. Regardless of the spin or the denial or the words in the United States Constitution, the truth is that this country was established on the genocide of Native sisters and brothers and the enslavement of African sisters and brothers. The founding fathers envisioned a white society rooted in a belief that to be human was to be white and to be black was to be inhuman. In their definitions, just 3/4. The truth is that we have built a nation with a crack in its foundation, that of racism, a spirit and a sin against humanity that flows not only in individual hearts and minds, but flows as a power and principality in every American system and structure, including our holy places, which carries its egg and sperm, granting spiritual anointing to the idolatry of whiteness, white power, and privilege. The vision of a democracy composed of we the people, I see it, is faded into an autocracy. Pluralism and diversity is being sacrificed for the power and privilege of the few. Afrophobia continues to flow through policies and systems that disempower, disconnect, divide, dislocate, resulted in death, destruction, inequality. And just as you cannot build a holy hill on a foundation that is cracked, you cannot build a holy nation, one nation under God, without acknowledging the crack. We've lost our grounding in community and collective responsibility, which erases any vision of justice or accountability to God or one another. Gladys Knight reminds us that what is too painful to remember, we simply choose to forget. Or we write it out of existence. Unless we name the sin, the disconnect, the division, the divide, we become a part of a false narrative. We are living in a retrogressive period. The critical race theory is being used to deny, disconnect, and divide. The governor of the state in which I reside, Glen, along with Florida's governor, Ron DeSantis, along with the majority of the members of the Supreme Court, appear to be dismembered, disconnected, and in a state of denial about the sin of this nation. Their complicity in the sin and their inability to face or tell the truth results in the creation of a false narrative, a narrative that now allows for the whitewashing of history, the banning of books. They're even banning books in the library. They're even banning Amanda's poem. The dismantling of affirmative action, and school boards all over this country are borrowing from our future because they have refused to learn from the past. None of us can escape the consequences of living in a moral vacuum, trapped in private destinies, doomed to whatever befalls us. So while I am honored by the invitation to offer the word in the Simpson-Hewett lecture, you got to know I'm not here so much as a lecturer, but I come as an elder with a story. It's what informs who I am in ways that have binding authority for what I'm called to do. What is foundational to my existence and to the narrative that I choose to live by is rooted in my faith, in my family, and in my quest for freedom. It is what my mother and father and the mothers and fathers of the Afro-Christian Convention instilled in me. It was what Macedonia Afro-Christian Church in Norfolk, Virginia instilled in me. It reminded me over and over again there was a different narrative, a different way to live. I had a baseline of truth that I could return to in the midst of a world of Afrophobia. 1305 Carey Street in Norfolk, Virginia was my home. Cora and Marcus Delk, my parents. The entire neighborhood was my community. They could speak to me with authority because they had the same dream for me that my parents had. The teachers in my schools were my community. I'm so glad I grew up there before integration. They could teach me with authority, my teachers, because they shared the same dream that my mothers and fathers had for me. And the preachers in our church could preach to me with authority because they shared the same dreams and narrative. They were there to remind me of my name, my family, the values that we live by, and that I had an assignment. I was born with an assignment to use my gifts and my talents for the well-being of the entire community. I did not live for myself alone. It was at Macedonia that I walked the aisle when I was 10 years old, gave my hand to Reverend Hosea Scott, and my heart to Jesus Christ. Macedonia was our safe space, a place where we could love God, love ourselves, love our neighbors. Macedonia was like the clearing that Toni Morrison writes in her book, Beloved. Toni Morrison, finding a clearing where in a world of hate, there is another narrative, a place where people can love and love themselves. Macedonia was my clearing. When my father, who dug graves at Calvary Cemetery Monday through Friday, entered the door of Macedonia, he was more than a grave digger. He was digging Delk. When my mother, who worked as a maid, entered our church on Sunday morning, she was Sister Delk. And at the center of the chancel of Macedonia stood and still stands the pulpit. And from there in that Bible, God's word was proclaimed with power and with truth. And Reverend Scott kept saying, remember who you are. Remember who you are. It was there that my mother and my father and my sisters and brothers and my other sisters and brothers by faith were freed from the law of a hostile environment where all the forces of our culture combined to say to me and my family that we were nothing or nobody. It was there that the preached word intersected with our identity crisis and struggle. The preached word, rooted in powerful biblical symbols, transcended the circumstantial realities, the cultural realities, the law of the land. There was a different narrative, a narrative that empowered us to name ourselves from the perspective of the gospel. We were the family of God, created in God's image. And once I and my siblings heard these words, we received the capacity to speak a word that could make a difference. We received the power to redefine situations by speaking and acting and being there. Words give us an identity. I will always remember the words of my baptism, Yvonne Virginia Delk. You're no longer a stranger or a sojourner. You are equal citizen with the saints and members of the household of God. When a world-changing word, has been spoken over you, into you, you've been named with an eternal name, and nobody or nothing can ever reduce you to namelessness again. For the past 2 years, I've been working on a book with other elders, Ivor Carruthers, Jeremiah Wright, Julius Speller, Vivian Lucas, K. Ray Hill, Brenda Square, Henry Simmons, Richard Taylor. And the book is about that convention that I grew up in, the Afro-Christian Convention. We'll call it the fifth stream. Sister Sarah have already mentioned, because we've always said there were 4 streams. there was, in fact, a fifth stream. It is a story about faith and family and freedom. And this convention represented the majority of African Americans that entered the United Church of Christ at the time of its founding in 1957. However, other than BBC, Barbara Brown Zygmunt, talking about hidden histories, that convention is absent from any of the historical documents that describe that founding moment. To ignore a story does not negate the truth of its existence, and to silence a story does not prevent the power of the story to live. There was a different narrative flowing in the midst of Afrophobia and critical race theory. The preservation of one's story is not only necessary, theological, but it's also critical to the grounding of historical, political, social truths. More than that, it is my way of connecting to a life-giving narrative. I refuse to allow the narrative of racism to be the narrative that defines who I am. It's a call to remember, to make whole. It's a call to live human in the face of death. Remembering is a sacred liturgy that grounds and equips one with an identity, meaning, and purpose. One of the old preachers in our church heard that I was going to national in 1969, the national church. I was going to be a staff member for the Board for Homeland Ministries of the United Church of Christ, where Howard Sprague would be, in fact, the head of the Homeland Ministries. And he came to me and he said, Yvonne, I don't know what's before you, but don't forget who you are when you enter. Remember, it equips us with an identity and meaning and purpose. It's a connection to all of life. I was connected to every mama and daddy that had come before me. I was connected to all of those who were around me. And as I moved in that space, they moved in that space with me. James Weldon Johnson echoed the same theme of the need for a grounding. He put pen to paper, calling for us to never forget our story, lest our feet stray from the places where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand. True grounding, true connected, true to having a baseline that in the midst of all the horrors that are around you, refuses to let you go. And you can stand with a degree of pride. The story of the Afro-Christian Convention, and I'm grateful to Sister Sarah for making it possible for everybody in this room to get a copy, because it also supports Franklinton Center in North Carolina that gives us some work to do. We got a lot of work to do, so I'm grateful for that. But that story is a narrative of remembering and reconnecting to a home base of God, a native land of truth and wisdom, and streams of living water that can flow from that home base for freedom, for coexistence, for unity, and for parity. Racism tries to dismember, but when you remember, you're calling back to that which has meaning. The Afro-Christian Convention is a story of an African people stolen from their homeland, transported through the Atlantic Ocean as part of the transatlantic slave trade, ending up in Fort Monroe, Virginia in 1619 with the label human cargo. It is a story of the power and presence of mothers and fathers experiencing the unspeakable horror of slavery, lynchings, Jim Crow, black codes, and daily attacks on their body, mind, and spirit. And it's a story about them not being victims, but being victorious. It's a story about faith and resistance, survival and liberation, love and justice. It's a story of a people carving out lived theology and sacred worship in the heart of America's original sin. This is a story of a people's journey with God through adversity towards justice, filled by faith in Jesus Christ and empowered by the Spirit of the African ancestors. And what's important about this story is their taproot, their anchor, their mooring. It's what Howard Thurman was talking about. That's something that will not give, that kept calling them back to memory, to hope, to community. To understand the Afro-Christian Convention and this taproot, it's important to begin with the declaration that the lifeline of the mothers and fathers of this convention did not begin in slavery. They had another narrative. They were connected to a lifeline that flowed from a well of knowing and believing that existed thousands of years before the birth of Christ. Africa was their homeland, and the mothers and fathers of the Afro-Christian Convention had a worldview that all of life was sacred. It was in Africa, their homeland, where they first met the divine. And it didn't matter how far they were removed from their homeland. They had a taproot flowing in them and through them. Empowered by this narrative, definitions couldn't contain them. Enslavement could not imprison them. God and family and freedom was present in the hush harbors, in the fields, around kitchen tables, wherever 2 or 3 gathered. Their ancestral traditions, cultures, ways of believing and doing were present. It's important where you begin your narrative. It's important. And this narrative begins with God as the Spirit of life flowing in through everything, declaring all life is sacred. There's no place that you're absent from the Spirit of God. God is connecting the air that you breathe, the water, the wind, the trees. God is the connecting Spirit to all of life, calling forth life out of death, order out of chaos. There was no place where they were absent from God's Spirit, whether on the slave ships, over my head, I hear music in the air. God is with us. There was no place, whether on those ships called Jesus or on auction blocks or in the church balconies of the one who used religion for control and domination. They had another story, another baseline. The narrative of the Afro-Christian Convention is one of God's Spirit flowing through every aspect of worship, creating and recreating life and hope through the preached word, in the music, in the prayers. It involves a total surrender, mind, body, spirit, to the will and way of God. Worship in the Afro-Christian tradition was the power, celebrating the power to survive and to affirm life with all of its complex, contradictory realities. In Afro-Christian worship, no spectators, all are participants. The word is experienced, the word is felt. Worship is more than a matter of the mind. It is the connection of your mind to your body and to your very soul. There's joy. There's movement, there's celebration. We're still here. In spite of the powers and principalities, we're still here, clothed in our right mind, empowered with a life force that allows one to sing, to stand, to move, to have your being. Every time I feel that Spirit moving in my heart, mind, and soul, I have to give God the praise. Every time I feel the Spirit liberating me from all the realities that's trying to hold me in captivity, I have to respond in joy and thanksgiving and gratitude. Every time I feel the Spirit, it restores me. It deconstructs my fear by reconstructing my faith. It deconstructs my despair by reminding me I got hope. It deconstructs my timidity and reconstructs my courage, enabling me to make it through another day. The narrative is rooted in community. It's the Spirit that we are connected. And no matter how the powers and principalities try to pull us apart and disconnect us, in the Afro-Christian tradition, it's about connections. You receive your life from those who came before you. You are with the ones now, here and now, but you're working for those who are going to come after you. It's connection in a circle. It's not hierarchical. It's in a circle that we live by the power and presence of the Holy Spirit. One is connected to the spirit and testimony of the ancestors who have gone before us. It's a taproot that we define in the word Ubuntu. I am because you are, and because you are, I can be also. My humanity is related to your humanity. Dr. King's words again, we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Ubuntu, our way of living in the Afro-Christian tradition, producing values of respect and dignity and compassion and co-responsibility, personhood and justice. And guess what? It embraces truth, but it also offers for restoration, restorative justice. What you make wrong, you got to make right. You can't live as if it is not there. In the Afro-Christian tradition, there's also forgiveness, reconciliation, and beloved community. The Afro-Christian Convention is rooted in freedom. It's the Spirit of God flowing free into all of life, redefining the meaning of sacred and secular. We divide everything up. We don't figure out how the Spirit of God flows in anything. I remember when they would say to me that even when the African mothers and fathers in Africa would cut the tree in order to be able to have housing or to warm themselves, they prayed to God for forgiveness for destroying the life force that was in the tree. The Afro-Christian tradition is rooted in freedom. It's life-giving space where we can be free, free from oppression, free from the powers and principalities, free to live in harmony, in unity, the freedom to live affirming all life as sacred. For the mothers and fathers of the Afro-Christian Convention, our church was everything: social space, freedom house, cultural center. It provided the space for survival and liberation. And in this space, those mothers and fathers appropriated Christianity to their taproot of God, that all life is sacred. Freedom was a taproot. The message of the gospel of Jesus Christ was related to the humanizing of the social, economic, and political structures of our world. Freedom is the gospel. Jesus is the liberator. The narrative of the Afro-Christian Convention is just one story. I'm not offering it as the story. It is one story that flows among us, just as the congregational sisters and brothers coming from England had a story, what they were leaving and what they were hoping for. Just as the evangelical reform sisters and brothers had a story about what they were leaving and what they were hoping for. And this is yet another story flowing into the life of the United Church of Christ, of one people's walk with God through oppression into life-giving space that could produce not just an Yvonne Delk, but many who are flowing like a river. I love it. When I think of Vincent Harding, there is a river that comes from a taproot and continues to flow for justice and wholeness, for life, for spirit, for freedom, for community in the midst of the times in which we live. I'm grateful that 60 years after I graduated from Andover Newton in September of 2022, the Historical Council of the United Church of Christ affirmed Thank you, BBC. Thank you, Barbara Brown-Zygmunt. Affirmed the Afro-Christian Convention as separate from the other streams and equal to the other 4 streams. This action rewrites and rewrites. It rewrites W-R-I-T and it makes right R-I-G-H-T. The history of the United Church of Christ. This action changes the time and place of the official history leading to the merger of the United Church of Christ. The mothers and fathers from this tradition entered the United States in 1619 at Fort Monroe, and this predates the arrival of the Puritans in 1628. Like all true encounters with the action of God in history, the story of the Afro-Christian tradition will have little meaning unless it produces new human action growing out of new faith. A history that does not press us into the future is dead. The Gospel of John, chapter 7, verses 38 says, "Whosoever believes in me, rivers of living water will flow from them." As an elder, Davida, you and I elders in this United Church of Christ, it is my hope that this story of an African people's journey with God through a life filled with racism and racial injustice, still they kept faith to a God of life and hope and freedom. And I hope that as we dig into the story, that it will become living waters for us as well, and that it can remember us and refresh us and renew our commitment to be the united and uniting church, proclaiming the gospel to all the world and resisting the powers of evil. Who or what defines who we are and ways that we are not free to walk away from? As we look back to see who we have authentically been, thank you, Amanda, we can also lean forward and to who we are becoming. Thank you.
We hope you might stay for a lunchtime reception where we will receive grace from our conference minister, Darrell Goodwin, and a word of greeting on behalf of the wider Andover community from Edith Boyd Crabtree. And now, hear these words of benediction. May the peace of God that passes all understanding keep your hearts and your minds in the knowledge and the love of God and of God's Son, Jesus Christ. And may the blessing of God Almighty, who created you, redeemed you, and will forever sustain you, be with you now and remain with you